We could see no national boundaries, no vast gulfs or high walls dividing people.
We who are interested in the security of democracy.
As each side attempts to prove to the world the superiority of its position.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead because I've been to the mountaintop.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual program on the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. My name is Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we are pleased to partner on this program with the UVA Club of Savannah. This conversation, the second of three with esteemed UVA faculty, is part of the Georgia Historical Society's Georgia History Festival, which this year is focused on the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Cold War. Our guest today is Dr. Kevin Gaines. Dr. Gaines is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the University of Virginia, with a joint appointment in the Corcoran Department of History and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. He is the first person to hold the Bond Professorship, created to honor the legacy of Julian Bond, the civil rights champion and former University of Virginia professor. Dr. Gaines is author of Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics, and Culture During the 20th Century, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1996, as well as American Africans in Ghana, Black Expatriates and the Civil Rights Era, also published by UNC Press in 2006. His current research is on the problems and projects of racial integration in the United States during and after the Civil Rights Movement. Kevin Gaines, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dan, for asking me.
So let's just jump right in here. Before we get into the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, I know that you think it's very important that we get a firm foundation for what the Civil Rights Movement was like before what we think of as the modern Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. Really, that begins, I think, with the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. If you will, begin by taking us back a little bit to talk about the Civil Rights Movement before Brown.
Absolutely. World War II really energized the Civil Rights Movement. And you had civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the Congress for Racial Equality, engaged in civil rights activities on a number of different fronts. They're fighting segregation in housing. They're fighting segregation on interstate transportation. There are, of course, the long-standing struggle to end segregation in public schools. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is leading that campaign to desegregate public schools, but also public higher education as well. So there's just a whole lot of activity on multiple fronts. There's a lot of voting rights activism. And World War II and the end of World War II really sort of creates this group that is sort of an unlikely but very, very much involved group within the civil rights movement. And that's returning World War II veterans, African-American veterans coming from service in Europe in the war to defeat global fascism, and they're coming home to their southern towns and districts, and they're demanding the right to vote. They're registering to vote, and they're really kind of the shock troops of the civil rights movement that we tend to forget about. People like Medgar Evers, who was the NAACP official in Mississippi. He and his brother had served in Europe, and they came back to their hometown, Decatur, Mississippi, and demanded the right to vote. Unfortunately, they met with armed resistance from local whites. This was a major issue. In the South after World War II, African-American war veterans were not inclined to obey the restrictions of Jim Crow. And so they refused to sit in the back of the bus. They demanded the right to vote. And that did spark a quite substantial violent backlash against these attempts by Black veterans to assert their rights.
And so even before Brown, then there's quite a bit going on. Was this widespread across the South? Was this primarily in one location, or was this something going on all over the region and maybe beyond the region?
I would say region-wide, but it's in places like Mississippi and Alabama where the backlash was the most violent and the most fierce.
Mm-hmm. Let's set the table a little bit and talk about what we hear these terms all the time. And I think it's important that we set the terms, and for our audience, and by the way, for our audience, as you listen, if you have questions, please submit those. We'll have time at the end to take some of your questions. Kevin, talk a little bit about the terms white supremacy and segregation. What did those terms mean on the ground for people living in the American South, let's say, right as the 1940s turned into the 1950s, before Brown and the decision, and that decision in 1954?
Well, segregation was a system of laws, of state laws that basically mandated that African Americans and whites be separated in all phases of public life. African Americans could not attend schools with whites. Every phase of public life, even down to cemeteries, were segregated. And segregation also ensured that African Americans would be kept at the lower rung of the economic order, that they were confined to jobs as sharecroppers, or for women, domestic workers, or confined to menial jobs. So segregation also contained, it was about racial separation. It was about keeping the races separate, but it was also to maintain African Americans in a subordinate economic position as well. Segregation was upheld by a system of state laws that basically denied African Americans in most southern states of the former Confederacy, the right to vote. You had disfranchisement laws written into southern state constitutions starting around 1890. So African Americans were deprived of the right to vote after having been able to vote, or at least Black men being able to vote during the Reconstruction governments in, after emancipation in the 1860s and 1870s. So segregation. Segregation.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was a system of law, but it was also a system of custom, and it was enforced by violence. It was enforced by, a constant intimidation of African Americans, of telling them where they could and could not go, how they needed to behave in relationship to whites. And, it was obviously a very sort of demeaning and demoralizing system. You mentioned white supremacy. Mm-hmm. Segregation was often justified by the states' rights ideology of Southern political leaders. They felt that the states should be able to manage their own political affairs without interference from the federal government, which there had been, under Reconstruction governments, there had been federal civil rights laws passed. And so you had the states' rights ideology that was the sort of the major sort of political defense of segregation. But underlying the states' rights ideology was a culture of white supremacy that basically held, and this was preached at all levels of white Southern society, from the pulpit, from the press, certainly from politicians, that African Americans were not citizens, they were not human, and that they were subjected to the systemic racism and violence of segregation.
So to be clear, even though the 15th Amendment, which was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, one of the Reconstruction Amendments that explicitly forbade denying someone the right to vote based on race, Southern states had been able to do an end around the 15th Amendment. Is that correct?
That's right. The state laws that were passed, or the state constitutions that were basically rewritten to strip African Americans and in many cases poor whites of the vote, used race neutral mechanisms. they established poll taxes, which would, disenfranchise poor people, right off the bat. They used literacy tests. They used a number of mechanisms that effectively made the 15th Amendment a dead letter for African Americans.
Mm-hmm. So we get now into, let's say, post-World War II. So the Cold War begins. This is obviously an ideological struggle. In early 1961, Attorney General Robert Kennedy came to my state, came to Georgia, to give a major address very soon after his brother, President Kennedy's inauguration, on civil rights at the University of Georgia. He said, and I want to quote him, "We, the American people, must avoid another Little Rock or another New Orleans. We cannot afford them. Such incidents hurt our country in the eyes of the world," unquote. UGA had just admitted 2 Black students, and RFK said that their graduation, quote, "will without question aid and assist the fight against communism and communist political infiltration," unquote. So that really gets us to the heart of what the subject that we're talking about today, which is, let's talk about how the civil rights movement was shaped by this ideological conflict called the Cold War, and in turn, how the Cold War was shaped by the civil rights movement.
Well, it's really important to think about what the civil rights movement was like before the Cold War. Among the other, sort of civil rights goals that I talked about was the goal of anti-discrimination in the workplace. And so labor unions and civil rights organizations were working hand in hand before the Cold War. After the Cold War, President Truman issued loyalty oaths to make sure that federal employees were not members of they had to pledge that they were not members of the Communist Party. And so the Cold War institutes a strong anti-communism in the federal policy that kind of gives Southern states a new lease on life. During World War II, people felt that if the United States won the war and defeated fascism, then segregation had to be on the way out, because segregation was predicated on a doctrine of racial supremacy. We were fighting against Nazis and their notion of Aryan supremacy. And people felt that ideologically that the Jim Crow South and its political leaders would not have a leg to stand on. And to some extent, even before the Cold War, civil rights activists were making and leaders were making the argument that racism in the United States and Jim Crow in the United States really hampered the war effort. What happened was that Southern segregationists were able to sort of use Cold War anti-communism to demonize the civil rights movement, to sort of put them in this category of subversives, this category of people who are suspected communists, this category of people who were going to trying to overthrow the US government. And so you have the Cold War making possible a systemic campaign against the NAACP and NAACP branches throughout the South. Southern states passed laws against the NAACP, and they're roundly accused of being communist. So in a way, the Cold War provided the Southern segregationists, the white supremacists, a way to attack the civil rights movement without seeming overtly racist. They were able to sort of attack the civil rights movement, not just on racial grounds, but on grounds of national security, as being suspected of subversion. This is a really complicated question. I'm sure that we can go into further detail on the relationship of the Cold War to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea, if you will talk about this idea of subversion, I'm just curious to know how the idea of promoting racial equality, which from our modern standpoint today, looking back over the last 75 years, it seems incredible that people could have made the argument that, as you said, we were fighting the Nazis. There was obviously a racial element involved in defeating Nazism. How were they able to try to pin that label of communist on civil rights champions, just anyone, the civil rights workers themselves? What was subversive about that?
Well, I mean, I think that the Jim Crow order was predicated on violence. It was predicated on delegitimizing the issue of civil rights. And I think, as I've tried to suggest, the Cold War gave Southern segregationists and people who were trying to, protect their way of life from desegregation and civil rights. It gave them another sort of way to discredit and demonize the movement. The Brown decision in 1954, the unanimous decision by the Supreme Court that basically struck down the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 that provided national legal sanction for the system of segregation. The Brown decision desegregate or was supposed to desegregate public schools. Unfortunately, the court didn't provide any kind of enforcement or implementation mechanism within Brown, and that sort of created a political vacuum for the white South to unify and organize what was called massive resistance to desegregation. And so, as part of this massive resistance movement, you heard a lot of the sort of the familiar ideologies. You heard states' rights ideology, against sort of this intrusive federal power. You had obviously invocations of narratives of white supremacy, but you also had the Cold War being mobilized by people who were part of this massive resistance movement. And I should say that massive resistance was an organized movement. You had throughout the South these organizations called white citizens councils, and they were seen as respectable. They usually involved the civic leaders, small business people in communities throughout the South. And they were seen as the respectable alternative to the sort of the domestic terrorists, the Ku Klux Klan. So the white citizens councils really had this very expansive notion of subversion. They not only felt that the civil rights movement was being instigated by communists, the proverbial outside agitators, but they also were responding to cultural changes as well. The 1950s and the Brown decision was a moment of this explosion of youth culture and youth music. And some of these white citizens councils in mobilizing whites against desegregation of schools were also mobilizing them against the threat posed by rock and roll music, Black music. And so you see these handbills that are issued by the citizens councils to vote in local elections to ensure that you elect officials who will not desegregate schools, and also to boycott record stores that sell Negro records because these are seen as corrupting white youth. So there's this broad category of subversion that goes over and above just the mere question of whether or not someone is a communist. The other thing is that the charge of the civil rights movement being influenced by communists was a really broad brush charge. There were people who had been on the left who were persecuted under sort of during Cold War McCarthyism, but there were other civil rights activists who were certainly not on the left, but maybe they had sort of traveled abroad, maybe they had studied African politics. And so these people sometimes found themselves under investigation for subversion. So it was a pretty broad brush charge that was, as Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin was known to do. It was a charge that was thrown about pretty recklessly.
And let's talk for a moment about one of the things that you mentioned just then, rock and roll. This is all happening at the same time. Obviously, in the early to mid 1950s, American culture is changing. It's becoming more of a youth culture. Of course, a lot of the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement will come from America's youth. Can you talk a little bit about that mixture? And you've touched on it there. I just want to expand on it a little bit. The idea that somehow rock and roll, Elvis, a lot of this stuff coming out of Memphis is somehow race music, that this is all, again, a plot to mix the races somehow in a way that is going to undermine Jim Crow.
Yeah, rock and roll.
So all this was seen as, yeah, it's dangerous. They saw it as dangerous. And
yeah, rock and roll was the subject of moral panics, not only in the South, but in the North as well. And in the South, there was concern that these rock and roll shows, even before segregated audiences, would create an environment in which Black and white youth were socializing together. Usually in the segregated South, at a rock and roll show, there'd be a Black performer on stage, or Black performers on stage, and then there'd be a rope line going through the audience area. And it was understood that the whites were supposed to stay on one side of the rope line, and the African Americans were supposed to stay on the other side to maintain, this sort of appearance of segregation. One of the popular artists of the time, the Platters, one of the members of the Platters basically said that rock and roll is a force against segregation, insofar as, like, in his experience, after a couple numbers, that rope line would go down, and the students would be, the young people would be mixing without regard to race. So there's this fear that rock and roll is going to, sort of promote race mixing, and obviously that's a very explosive fear in the South, in which one of the greatest racial taboos in the South was sexual, the fear of sexual contact between Black men and white women. So there's that is a fear that that segregationists, that rock and roll tended to trigger for a lot of whites in the South and pro-segregation whites. The other thing about rock and roll and its dominance in American culture is that to be a popular artist was generally seen as apolitical, but it could be political at the same time. And so there was during the Cold War state, it just seemed like a policy of national security. And this really goes back to World War II, in which celebrities would be drafted into the armed forces. And Hollywood actors like James Stewart served during World War II. The heavyweight champion Joe Louis, of course, African American, served with the U.S. Army during World War II. And during the Cold War, you had the same kind of practice. Elvis Presley, then the #1 male singer, best-selling male singer, was drafted and served in Germany. He was, of course, not going to be placed in any kind of hot war. He wasn't taken to the battlefront. But this drafting of American celebrities was a way to sort of promote, the U.S. Cold War foreign policy. When you get a little bit later into the Vietnam War and the youth counterculture, obviously, you have probably the world's most famous war resistor in heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. So there's really sort of a pushback against the U.S. government's attempt to co-opt celebrities to serve its sort of larger Cold War domestic and foreign policy needs.
One of the things I want to talk to you about, or ask you about, is where did the political leadership come from? As the civil rights movement began to unfold in the 1950s, we tend to think about it being a fight between the forces of reaction in the South, primarily white people, But the question, I guess what I'm getting at is, where did the two major political parties in America, then as now, Republicans and Democrats, where did they come down on the issue of civil rights as it evolved through the early 50s into the mid 60s? For our audience, help them understand. We've just come through a major election. We've come through a very tumultuous year ourselves. Where did the two major parties land on this? Is it too easy to think that one party was here, one party was there? Take us through that, if you will.
Well, I mean, to begin with, there were really sort of two Democratic parties. There was the Democratic Party of the South, which was whites only. African Americans had been essentially stricken from the voter rolls. And so you would have basically a white electorate in the South electing white political leaders who were pro-segregation and anti-civil rights. And so you have some very sort of staunch segregationists who are extremely powerful in Congress, who've amassed a tremendous amount of seniority, people like Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, James Eastland of Mississippi, et cetera. And they are sort of the kingpins of the Democratic Party in the South. And really, they hold a disproportionate amount of power within the Democratic Party because they basically have veto power for any kind of legislative agenda for a Democratic president, such as Franklin D. Roosevelt or Harry Truman or later John F. Kennedy. But there's the Northern Democratic Party, which is racially diverse. The Great Migration of millions of African Americans to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh created these African American voting blocks. So the segregated neighborhoods in the North became the basis for African Americans, and these are Democratic Party districts. It became the basis for African Americans to elect their own representatives. And so you have longtime African American Democrats in Congress like Adam Clayton Powell, who served in New York and Harlem, Charles Diggs in Detroit, et cetera. And so there's two Democratic parties. And obviously the African American politicians of the Democratic Party are, pro-civil rights, are supporting civil rights. The Republican Party is a little bit more of a mixed bag. You have certainly anti-civil rights and pro-segregation Republicans outside. Well, I mean, there are no Republicans in the South, basically. The South is a one-party political system dominated by Democrats under the sign of white supremacy.
Who, for all intents and purposes, are white conservatives, right? We would tend to think.
Yes, they're white conservatives, absolutely. I mean, there are white Southern Democrats who did support FDR's New Deal reform legislation. They supported Social Security, but their support was conditioned on their ability to administer Social Security in a discriminatory way. So that what happened was one of the Mississippi congressmen who was influential in drafting the Social Security legislation basically struck from all of the occupations eligible for Social Security benefits, agricultural workers and domestic workers. And so that at one fell swoop excluded African Americans from Social Security. So the Democratic Party, that's what I mean when I say the Democratic Party had this sort of disproportionate power within the Democratic Party. And just to get back to the Republican Party, there are anti-civil rights Republicans outside the South, but there are more moderate Republicans. And in states that have, in which African Americans constitute a significant voting bloc, those moderate Republicans who may have been sort of on the fence on the question of civil rights eventually came to realize that it was probably in their political interest to make support for civil rights legislation bipartisan. That is, bipartisan in which moderate Republicans joined liberal Democrats in the North to support civil rights. And that would be the coalition in Congress that supported, that eventually ended up passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was obviously a very intense struggle. Southern congressmen put up a lengthy filibuster to try to kill civil rights legislation. Democrats in Congress had used the filibuster to defeat something like 5 civil rights bills before finally the a Civil Rights Act was passed in 1957, but it was a very, very watered down bill that really didn't change the situation of African Americans, didn't really make that much of a difference in challenging segregation. So politically, the Southern Democrats are dead set opposed. They're really sort of the hardcore opponents of the civil rights movement, and they're joined by Democratic governors. Some of the most vocal opponents of civil rights were Southern governors, like George Wallace of Alabama, or Orville Faubus of Arkansas.
John Patterson in Alabama before Wallace.
That's right. And JFK, really had to go all out to get John Patterson's endorsement during his campaign. And so the Democratic candidates for president like JFK really have to walk a fine line. They want to contend for the African American vote in some of these northern cities, because they know that can sort of tip the balance in their favor in a close election. And of course, the JFK election in 1960 against the Republican nominee Richard Nixon was an extremely close election. So JFK wanted to claim the African American vote, but he also did not want to seem to be supporting civil rights so strongly that he would antagonize Southern Democrats like Patterson and drive them out of the coalition.
So just to jump ahead a little bit, but in 1964, the Republican nominee for president, Barry Goldwater, famously had voted against the Civil Rights Act. And it tends, if you come to this just sort of as a student of the civil rights movement, you tend to think Republicans opposed the civil rights movement and Democrats supported it, but it really did not break down that way at all. Yeah.
I mean, Goldwater was a sort of
something of an anomaly, right?
Yeah. He was someone who would become the spokesman of the New Right. The New Right was, they opposed the Civil Rights Bill. They really were extreme Cold Warriors. I mean, they were. They felt that the United States government had been infiltrated with subversives, and so they sort of carried the Cold War anti-communism to a whole nother level. But you did have in the end, when the roll was called on the Civil Rights Bill legislation in 1964, obviously the Democratic Party, the white Southern Democratic Party, was unanimous in their opposition, and Johnson was able to peel off some of those moderate Republicans to join the liberal Democrats in outside the South to gain the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Kevin, one of the things about the what we might call the grand narrative of the civil rights movement is, of course, looking at it almost as a top-down movement. We tend to focus upon leaders like Dr. King or Malcolm X or Ralph Abernathy, even John Lewis, who in some ways, of course, was a very young foot soldier at that time. But you have pushed back against the idea of the charismatic leader narrative of the civil rights movement. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the civil rights scholarship has focused on King, and I think King, with good reason. King is truly an extraordinary figure, someone who was able to articulate the aspirations of African Americans, the aspirations of the movement, and Dr. King, I think, after an initial wave of scholarship on the movement that that focused on King and the SCLC and King's dealings with the presidential administrations that he partnered with, particularly LBJ. There's been a turn towards looking at more unsung leaders, looking at women leaders of the civil rights movement. People think about the March on Washington as the place where Dr. King gave that, that famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but it wasn't really discussed in the scholarship until fairly recently that African-American women were leaders of the movement, of whom there were many. There was Daisy Bates, of the NAACP official in Arkansas, who really sort of managed the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock. There was Daisy Bates. There was, of course, the widow, the recent widow of Medgar Evers, Myrlie Evers. There was Dorothy Height of the National Council of Negro Women. There were a host of other local leaders. And then there were some unsung women leaders, people who were just not in the limelight at all, but who made an incredible contribution to the movement. Ella Baker was an NAACP official, a Black activist going back to the 1930s. And she is single-handedly responsible for building the NAACP infrastructure throughout the South during World War II, on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. Ella Baker traveled alone on trains and met with African Americans in local communities and in churches and set up NAACP chapters. And so, she really built that organization. She's known as the mother of the movement for that, and for also her role as a senior advisor to another important, very important civil rights organization that has gotten much more scholarly attention, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was this grassroots movement of African-American students, throughout the South, historically Black colleges. And this was a younger generation of African-Americans who said that we are not going to tolerate the existence of segregation. And so for first-year students at North Carolina A&T, a historically Black college in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided they were going to go into the town and sit at the lunch counter, which did not serve Black people in Greensboro, until they were served. It didn't work the first day, but the word spread and it launched the sit-in movement. And in the next few months, hundreds of thousands of Black, well, I wouldn't say that many, but I would say thousands of Black students were involved in these sit-ins to demand service in public accommodations, equal service at department stores, at dime store lunch counters, and they were able to desegregate a lot of those places where African Americans, they could shop, they could make purchases at these stores, but they couldn't be served at the lunch counters. So the sit-in movement and the energy led to the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Ella Baker was a mentor for a lot of these students. And of course, all of the existing civil rights organizations and leaders like Dr. King of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, they're trying to recruit the students who were, sort of energized by the sit-in movement. Of course, John Lewis was one of them. They're trying to recruit them into their organizations. And Ella Baker says, no, form your own organization. And, you can actually struggle for substantive justice and substantive freedom. That, the purpose of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was to really transform Southern society, to empower Black people, even the most marginalized and oppressed Black people. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was basically committed to this notion that, they were really the antithesis of the charismatic leadership that was modeled by Dr. King. They felt that they could go into the Mississippi Delta and organize the most marginalized Black people and train them up to be their own leaders and empower them that way. And that was their goal. And they led voting rights drives. In fact, it was sort of Cold War politics that really sort of gave SNCC a boost in their strategy for voter registration. You know, the Kennedy administration, I think, as you alluded, they really did not want to see these civil rights crises, these upheavals that were caused by white resistance to desegregation. They didn't want to see any more Little Rocks with mobs in the streets preventing, 9 clean-cut African-American youth from basically going to school. They didn't want to see the freedom rides in which, and a lot of these people, these nonviolent direct action activists were trying to test, federal desegregation orders in interstate transportation. And so they rode buses into the Deep South and they got brutalized by, white mobs and vigilantes. So Robert Kennedy felt that this was embarrassing, these scenes of mayhem in the South, totally contradicting, the United States officials' desire to be perceived as leaders of the free world. Robert Kennedy basically told the activists in SNCC and the Congress for Racial Equality to stop the freedom rides, stop these protests, because they're creating all this unrest, and it's embarrassing the United States, and it's playing into the hands of the Soviet Union. And of course, the activists in the civil rights movement, didn't really think that the Cold War was more important than their struggles for freedom.
We are rapidly moving along in our time here, but before we begin taking questions, Kevin, I wanted to get this down on a personal level. One of the most defining moments, if you will, of the civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi in the summer, August 28, 1955. You have a very personal touch with that event. Will you tell us about that?
Well, the Emmett Till, I don't know if I've got the text with me. I thought I did, but my grandfather in Cleveland, who lived in Cleveland at that time, Ernest Wakefield Stevens, was a poet, and he wrote a poem marking the death of Emmett Till, and it's a quite forceful condemnation of the events in Mississippi, and I feel that I had it at hand, but unfortunately,
that's all right.
It doesn't seem
well, but
yeah.
It is a very moving poem, and even we shared it together recently, and you were struck by even some of its Cold War overtones.
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather had clearly picked up on this notion that that such atrocities as happened to Emmett Till and happened to other Black people in Mississippi and other places were an embarrassment to the United States, particularly in the Cold War struggle, to present itself as the beacon of freedom and democracy. And so what you have in places like Mississippi and within Jim Crow societies is really the antithesis of those values of freedom and democracy that U.S. Policymakers wanted to project worldwide.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to open this up to our audience here. We have a couple of questions, and I'll pose one of these to you now. What acts of resistance did Southern African Americans engage in prior to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954? Was resistance individual and or collective?
I would say that the resistance was individual. You had African Americans as individuals defying segregation on interstate transportation. There was one instance of an African American activist named Pauli Murray. And she's actually a figure who has gotten a lot of scholarly attention. She was one of the intellectual architects for the NAACP's legal arguments that struck down Plessy and the whole principle of separate but equal. But she's also a really important figure for the origins of the women's movement. She was a founder of the second wave feminist organization, the National Organization of Women. She had been an activist going back to the 1940s, and she violated a segregation law. I believe she was riding a bus in Virginia and violated a segregation law. And you had examples of people who were sort of protesting. The Congress of Racial Equality had a bunch of an interracial group of nonviolent activists who were pacifists, and they were challenging segregation in northern cities. They would have sit-ins, precursors to, I guess, the sit-in movement of the early 1960s, and they would desegregate restaurants and other sort of public establishments in northern cities. So you did have segregation. It wasn't really sort of enshrined in the law, but you did have these sort of customary practices of racial discrimination in some places in the North. And so the core activists, including Bayard Rustin and other pacifists, were challenging segregation. They also were testing desegregation orders in transportation. So there was a precursor to the Freedom Rides, the Journey of Reconciliation by these Black activists in 1947. And they did not encounter much resistance, but they were only going through the Upper South. Mm-hmm. So you do have, and even in Birmingham, I mean, everyone sort of thinks about Rosa Parks and her act of defiance, her refusal to give up her seat to a white person that launched the Montgomery bus boycott, launched the Montgomery movement. You know, African Americans in Birmingham had been challenging the segregation laws on the public transportation system. And, you know, it didn't really sort of ignite into a movement, but there had been these kinds of acts of individual resistance to Jim Crow, which was a really demeaning system. I mean, the bus drivers had police power, they had guns, they could arrest you. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, this was a humiliating system that people obviously protested and pushed back against, even if there wasn't a movement behind them.
Another question. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. As late as the 1950s, African Americans continued to support the Republican Party in large numbers. Did the Republican Party lose support from African Americans before Goldwater in 1964 and the Nixon silent majority campaign? And if so, how did that happen?
Well, that's a really great question. Interestingly enough, in the 1960 campaign, Dr. King's father, Dr. King was the son of a Baptist minister, really the grandson of a Baptist minister as well. Dr. King's father, Martin Luther King Sr., declared that he was going to support Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee. And he actually went so far as to say that he was supporting Nixon because he always voted Republican, but also because he could not support Kennedy as a Roman Catholic. Mm-hmm. And Dr. King's father eventually changed his mind when JFK and his brother Robert intervened to secure the release of Dr. King from a jail in Atlanta. So I just mentioned that to suggest that African Americans, older African Americans in particular, have this history of voting for the Republican Party. The Republican Party, as the questioner said, was still seen as the party of Lincoln and the party of emancipation and Black rights. It wasn't until the 1936 election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, in which the majority of the African American vote, and of course the African American vote is concentrated in the North, where African Americans, had voting rights, had the right to vote. The 1936 election was the first election in which a majority of the Black vote voted for the Democratic Party in the national election instead of the Republicans. And so that was a trend. And I think, even in these years, the majority of African Americans are voting Democratic, but there are still quite a few African American Republicans, usually the owners of African American newspapers, African American business community leaders. They still tend to vote Republican. It's not really until the Civil Rights Act that you see these huge majorities of African Americans voting for the Democratic Party, and the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon of really sort of seeing the disaffected white Democrats in the South upset with civil rights reforms as the low-hanging fruit for Republican politicians. It's not until you see that Southern strategy, which really sort of takes hold in subsequent electoral campaigns and GOP administrations, that you see the overwhelming majority of African Americans voting for the Democratic Party in national elections. I think Jimmy Carter got something, like 8 out of 10 Black voters. And obviously, it's been a little higher in some other cycles. Hope that gets it.
And of course, yeah, and I think the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 65 played an enormous role in that realignment as well.
No question. I mean, LBJ felt that there were some political hits that the Democratic Party would take in the South, but those would be offset by the gains of newly enfranchised African American voters for the Democratic Party.
Another great question here. How did the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 granting women the right to vote impact men and women of color?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, one of the things that's really important to understand about African American politics and African American political behavior is that African Americans supported women's suffrage. Sort of African American civil rights leaders who were male, think of W.E.B. Du Bois of the NAACP, supported women's suffrage because they felt that the enfranchisement of women, including Black women, would benefit African Americans. And so the problem was that the women's suffrage movement at that time was racially polarized. You had women suffragists from the white South who really opposed, who supported the disfranchisement of all African Americans and opposed the enfranchisement of Black women. And so the northern wing of the women's suffrage movement, of course, was more sort of racially diverse. And African Americans supported women's suffrage in the run-up to the 19th Amendment because they knew that would be to the political benefit of the group. Now, even before the 19th Amendment, African American women were able to vote in some places like Illinois. Initially they were able to vote in local elections, and then Illinois basically made it possible for women to vote. And so African Americans are using the vote, and they're, and some of these folks are actually products of the Great Migration. They have a sort of a political memory that goes back to Reconstruction. And so they basically see their ability to vote, even if all women are not yet able to vote, their ability to vote in state elections in Illinois as something that is going to benefit Black people in general. So there's this sense that that comes from this historical experience in which African Americans see and African American women see the vote as voting as a tool in order to gain political power for those African Americans who are still oppressed, are still disenfranchised. So I think that kind of understanding of the importance of the vote certainly was sort of redefined and transformed by the Civil Rights Movement and all of this, the sacrifice and the struggle to gain the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But I do think that there's this deep historical experience in which the vote is seen as a tool, not for people to exercise power for themselves, but to exercise power for other powerless people.
Last question you have, I'll give you 3 minutes to answer this. A good question, it's sort of broad. Can you talk about the tendency in this country to equate those who champion social justice, civil rights, to equate them with America's enemies? Going back to the charges that early civil rights leaders were in favor of race mixing, to charges of Dr. King and others being communists, to the current claim that many of those seeking social justice are Antifa. Can you talk about that in 3 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the enemies of racial justice have historically tended to deny the legitimacy of the movement, and to basically equate it with an internal enemy, or to equate it with violence and disorder. So, I mean, I think that there's a certain mentality out there that, when I'm talking about nonviolent protests, what the enemies of racial justice here are riots, and then I think there's a sort of a tendency to delegitimize the cause of racial justice, to delegitimize protests, peaceful protests, nonviolent protests, and to claim that there's something sinister driving those protests. It could be sort of communists, and we still are hearing a lot of sort of alarmist and reactionary references to socialism and communism. But the Antifa has just become the sort of the new way to, it's a blunt instrument that's used by political leaders and people in the sort of the mass media and really on the far right to deny the validity and legitimacy of the cause of racial justice, and to basically ignore that the overwhelming majority of these protests are happening peacefully. And it's always a way to change the subject. By talking about Antifa or communists, we're not talking about a system of violence and oppression against Black people. We're no longer talking about problems of police brutality or segregation, or just really sort of the cruelty of systemic racism. We're talking about this threat, which is really kind of a fiction. But at any rate, as I said, this sort of hyping up, sort of domestic and foreign enemies and using them to, sort of stigmatize the movement is a way to change the subject from the problems of oppression that actually, made the movement necessary.
Kevin Gaines is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the University of Virginia. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks.